how do we determine the boundaries, the lines between which we travel in terms of our deen, in being too lax or too rigid in terms of the practice of our deen. He mentions that there is the rukhas, the permissions, the things that Allah has made concessions for in the deen in terms of the being easy, and then there's the judgments or the hukms that are there in the religion as well. The black and white rulings without context, without consideration. So the rukhas, and he says there's the rukhas in the event of hardships, etc., and judgments that require patience. That being the case, whoever operates within the guidelines of the religion, whoever drives between the lines, so to speak, should be free of blame. So anyone that stays within those two boundaries, in other words, if they're being easy, if they're taking it easy, but they're doing so based on the rukhas of Allah, on the concessions of Allah that He's made available to them, there's no blame. There's no legitimate blame for that individual. If they are taking the permissions, taking the concessions of Allah. In fact, you find one statement from the Prophet ﷺ, the gist of it, meaning that Allah loves that His rukhas, His concessions, are taken advantage of. These are a mercy that He creates, that He puts in the Sharia for people to take advantage of, so that it doesn't become too burdensome, too heavy on them to practice their deen in whatever circumstance they might find. Especially when you talk about trying to practice the deen in the West and the situations we deal with, being a minority and being many times in a state of weakness, individually or collectively. These rukhas, these concessions, are there to alleviate the burden we might feel if we try to be rigid in our application of deen in this context. Those concessions allow us to still remain congruent with our deen, with the practice of our faith, while being in the circumstance that we are. And so this is a mercy from Allah and allows Islam to be applicable and enjoyable in every circumstance, in every time, in every place. There's no reason we can't practice Islam in a given situation necessarily, inshallah. So if you're staying between these boundaries of the hukms of Allah and the rukhas, the concessions, then there's no blame upon you. There should be no blame upon you for that. As a matter of fact, sometimes opting for the concession, taking advantage of the rukhas, can be much better than opting for endurance due to its great effect. In other words, being very strict and literal and rigid in your application of deen can be actually the less appropriate action. That taking advantage of the concession could be the higher goal or higher purpose, the more righteous spiritual act, even though to some people's minds it might seem like you're watering down the deen. In fact, you're practicing the deen according to its intended meaning, its wisdom and its purpose, which requires an appreciation and an understanding of these concessions. For this reason, he continues, if those ascetics, those mutazahidun, learned that knowledge, the ilm, necessitates ma'rifah, that having knowledge, academic learning, if you will, necessitates ma'rifah. Ma'rifah is a type of knowledge, but it's a knowledge that is lived, a knowledge that is gained through experience, understanding, where you taste the knowledge, if you will. You experience its effects, its reality in existence, in life. The ma'rifah of Allah. And so in such a state, hearts fear Him greatly and bodies melt down because of the caution of His punishment. They would have known that looking after the health and of the bodies is required to endure and maintain that strength. In other words, you don't want to become too harsh on yourself, because the strength of your body is required to maintain the acts of worship, to maintain the devotion that it is that you would seek to do. You can't become too hard, and he touches upon this in this final point that he's going to make. He says, furthermore, as the instruments of knowledge and memorization, alat al-ilm wal-hifdh are the heart, qalb, and the mind, fikr. When the instrument is eased, then quality of work improves. In other words, if you take care of your heart and your mind adequately, then they perform better than if you push them hard, constantly, they wear down, they break down. They need rest, they need relaxation. Even the example that comes to mind as I'm reading this is one of the companions, I want to say it was Ibn Masud, but I'm not 100% certain on it. But one of the companions was in the habit of giving a dars every Thursday to his students. And they spoke to him one time and saying, "We wish you would do more." And he said, "I don't want to become overburdensome on you." He wanted to give them just enough so that they would be eager, constantly eager to come to take more. If you receive too much, you become bored with it, or you become desensitized to it. It doesn't hold the same value for you. So understanding that you need to pace yourself. And this is something that, as a side point, from an outreach perspective, converts oftentimes have a challenge when they start out. They start out with a lot of zeal, a lot of energy, and a lot of enthusiasm to try and learn, and they wind up many times overburdening themselves with lots of information that many times they're not ready for. They delve into issues that are far too advanced for them, or maybe not priority for them at that moment, and they become overwhelmed, and then they struggle. So understanding the idea of pacing ourselves when it comes to practicing of our deen. The work improves, and he says, this information cannot be obtained except by knowledge. However, the ignorance, the jahal of these ascetics, these mutazahidun about religion and their lack of knowledge caused them to object to what they did not know. In other words, they didn't know that they didn't know the proper estimation of things. They were so focused on detaching from the dunya that they didn't see the remainder of the deen. And this is something that's a danger. This is even when you look at the extremism that people fall into sometimes. Many times extremism is fallen into because they over-fixate on a certain aspect of the deen, and they take it out of its context, and they try to accelerate or amplify that issue to a point that was not intended. And so it becomes destructive. They assumed that the purpose of creating their bodies is to exhaust the bodies. Well, in fact, they are unaware that even excessive fearing of Allah, that causes the wear and tear of the body. In other words, when you're very fearful, you stay up all night, or you're praying constantly, you're fasting constantly, you're doing all of these things out of a sense of fear and awe of Allah, says that it requires a break to survive. In other words, you can't keep doing that. There's many descriptions of the companions looking so gaunt and so depleted from the worship that they did because they were so excited, but they had a spiritual strength that we don't have. And so you don't want to push yourself so hard. You don't want to become the reason for your losing strength later on. You want to pace yourself. And to survive, as someone said, ease the hearts so they can understand the remembrance of Allah. And I'll close on this last point, which is a reminder of one of the stories of one of the companions when he was a young man. And actually, he's in the hadith literature, he's telling this story as an old man. When he was a young man, he came to the Prophet and asked him for something extra that he could do in terms of fasting. The Prophet initially started saying that you should fast 3 days out of every month. He said, I'm young, I'm strong, I can do more. He said, okay, do Mondays and Thursdays. He said, I'm young, I'm strong, I can do more. So he said, okay, fast one day, then break your fast the next, but don't do more than that. He said, okay. So he took that on as a sunnah that he was going to practice, and the way the companions did these things, whenever they took on a voluntary act like this, it was something, they didn't do it because they were feeling a spiritual high. They did it because they intended to commit to it, to make it a lifestyle, a habit of theirs. So he took this on as a young man when he felt he was strong, he was capable, he could do so much. But now he's telling the story as an old man. And he concludes the story by saying, I wish I had taken the rukhas of the messenger when he had told me to do 3 days every month. Because as an old man, he was still doing this, one day on, one day off. But as an old man, it was becoming very difficult for him. And he understood now in his old age what the Prophet tried to communicate to him as a young man. He understood his nature. The way the Prophet would answer people was based on his knowledge of their character, of their personality, of their makeup. And so his initial answer was most likely the most appropriate for him in the long haul. Not the largest number of things, but the thing that was appropriate, the thing that you can do continually. And as the Prophet ﷺ has said, that the most beloved deed to Allah is the one that is done constantly, consistently, even if it's small. So being mindful of our capacity for continuation and for the rest and the re-energization of our bodies that we need so that we can continue on continuously. We sometimes get fixated on the moment, but we have to understand our deen is not about moments. Our deen is about a lifetime. Making it from the beginning to the end and still being upon the sirat al-mustaqim, inshallah. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.